It started with a whisper of movement in the storm drain behind the old train station, a place no one visited anymore, except the janitor who swept broken bottles once a week. And it was he, Mr. Lawson, a quiet man in his 60s, with bad knees and a soft spot for strays, who heard the faintest meow beneath the roar of the passing freight and stopped in his tracks, thinking he imagined it, until he heard it again, desperate and raw. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the ache in his joints, and peered into the dark grate. And there she was, just a blur of matted white fur, two golden eyes wide with hunger and fear, trapped halfway in a collapsed tunnel pipe, with her back legs unmoving and her chest rising in quick, shallow jerks. He didn't think, just acted, calling 911 with shaking fingers, his voice cracking as he begged for animal control, firefighters, anyone. But hours passed and no one came, so Lawson returned that night with bolt cutters, a flashlight and an old fleece jacket, and crawled through gravel and wet cement until he reached her. By then, she was silent, barely breathing, one paw twitching like a dying heartbeat. He wrapped her in the jacket and carried her home, not knowing if she would survive the hour. But she did. He named her Willow, and for the first week, she didn't move, only blinked when he changed her bandages and fed her broth with a syringe. But slowly, miraculously, she fought her way back, learning to trust again, learning to walk with a limp that somehow made her even more graceful. And when he finally took her to the vet for a full checkup, they scanned her and froze. Willow had been reported missing 7 years ago from a family 4 states away. A girl named Amelia had cried herself to sleep every night for months after losing her. And when Lawson contacted the family, they offered to drive up that very day. But he hesitated, because by then, Willow had become part of his heartbeat. But when the family arrived, and Amelia, now 10, stepped out of the car and whispered, "Willow." The cat lifted her head, limped over, and climbed into the girl's arms like she had never left at all. Lawson cried for the first time in years, not out of grief, but out of awe, knowing that love, even when lost, never really dies. It just waits to be found again. Weeks passed after Willow's reunion with Amelia, and though the house felt emptier without the soft padding of feline footsteps, Mr. Lawson never once regretted his decision. Instead, he found himself returning to the train station more frequently, bringing scraps of food, checking the drains, watching for any sign of movement. He didn't say it aloud, but something in him had changed, like Willow's survival had reignited an old part of him that believed in second chances, not just for animals but for himself. One afternoon, he found another stray, a young ginger kitten limping through the gravel, a wire tight around its hind leg like someone had left it to suffer. But Lawson scooped it up, held it close and whispered, "You're safe now," before taking it home, cleaning the wound, and naming it Finch. From there, it became routine. Cats started appearing one by one, as if drawn to his quiet devotion, until his modest home became a haven for the broken, the forgotten, the overlooked. Word spread fast, and soon neighbors, then strangers, began donating supplies, offering help. A local reporter did a piece on the cat whisperer of Fairline Station, and that single story sparked a GoFundMe campaign started by Amelia's mother that raised more than anyone expected. Within 6 months, with the help of local volunteers, they built the Willow shelter, a quiet little cottage-style rescue on the edge of town with a plaque outside that read, "In honor of a cat who came back and the man who never gave up, Lawson visited every day, sitting on the porch as kittens tumbled over his boots, and sometimes Amelia and Willow would visit too, the girl now older, the cat now slower, but both with eyes that still recognized love in its simplest form. And in the soft hush of those afternoons, as the wind rustled the leaves and the sun painted the shelter golden, Lawson would smile to himself, knowing that the miracle he rescued from a storm drain had not just returned to a family, it had found a way to rescue him too. The years passed gently for Mr. Lawson, each season marked not by calendars, but by the arrivals and recoveries of stray souls who found their way to the Willow shelter, each one adding another quiet chapter to his legacy. And though his hands grew slower and his steps more careful, his presence never faded. Every morning he brewed a cup of black coffee, then sat on the shelter's porch in his worn flannel jacket, always with at least one cat curled at his feet, as if even the wildest knew they were safe in his shadow. He never spoke much about his past, but those who visited knew enough that he had once been invisible, just another man doing quiet work in the background, until the day he chose not to walk past a sound in the dark drain. And when winter came sharp one year, and his health faltered, he wrote a simple letter and gave it to Amelia, now a young woman volunteering part-time at the shelter, with Willow still trailing loyally at her side. Inside, he asked only this: that the shelter never close, never forget why it began, and that the plaque outside remain untouched. He passed peacefully one December night, Willow at his side, as if keeping one final vigil, and at his memorial, held right there, at the shelter, beneath the old willow tree they'd planted together, crowds came not in suits or silence, but in denim and warmth, holding rescued cats in carriers, sharing stories of the animals he'd saved, homes he'd helped build, and hope he'd quietly restored. Amelia read the final words from his letter aloud. "All I ever did was stop walking. Everything else came after." And as dusk fell over the rows of sleeping cats, the wind stirred the chimes above the door, ringing softly like a bell in the heart. Because in the end, Lawson wasn't just a man who rescued a cat. He was the reason 1,000 more would live to be loved. The story of Mr. Lawson and Willow reached far beyond Fairline. After the local news picked up Amelia's heartfelt memorial reading, and a photo of Willow curled beside his framed portrait on the shelter porch, an online post went viral. And within days, thousands of people from across the country were sharing stories of their own rescues, of the quiet strangers who'd helped them, of animals they found in the darkest places who somehow brought light back into their lives. And something rare happened. People didn't just scroll past, they acted. Donations poured in. Volunteers traveled miles just to clean floors or install heating in the winter wing. Shelter staff from other towns wrote letters asking to name rooms after Lawson, and a national foundation granted the shelter enough to expand into a second location, Lawson House, built in the neighboring county where services were scarce, but the need was great. Amelia became its first director, young and steady like Lawson had once been, her voice soft but certain. And Willow, now slow and silver around the ears, remained the quiet mascot of it all, her story told to every child who stepped through the doors, unsure, scared, or in pain, because they understood something vital. Willow's journey wasn't unbelievable because it was dramatic or loud. It was unbelievable because it had been so nearly missed, so easily ignored, until one man listened and decided she mattered. And now, his listening had echoed into an entire movement where thousands of willows were heard, held, and healed. And on the shelter wall in both locations, hung side by side, were two things: the photo of Lawson holding Willow for the first time, and a framed copy of his last words. All I ever did was stop walking. Everything else came after. 2 years after Lawson's passing, Amelia sat alone on the back porch of Willow Shelter's second location, a gentle evening wind rustling the trees planted in the courtyard, each one named after an animal that had once been rescued and rehomed, a tradition she started in his honor. And as she held a clipboard filled with notes, vet schedules, and intake forms, her gaze drifted to the large bronze plaque embedded in the stone path beneath her feet, in memory of those who stop for the forgotten. Every morning, the shelter opened its doors to new cases: a frost-bitten kitten left behind a diner, a senior tomcat whose owner had passed, a blind calico kitten brought in by a delivery driver who refused to leave her behind. Each rescue felt like a thread in a larger tapestry, one Lawson had unknowingly begun the moment he crawled into that cold storm drain after hearing a sound others would have ignored. Willow, now arthritic but ever watchful, remained the heart of the original shelter, while Amelia spent most days overseeing the expansion. The mobile clinic, the rescue van now operating across rural counties, and the training of new volunteers not just in procedures, but in presence. How to kneel, how to listen, how to wait. She taught them that it wasn't about saving every life. It was about not letting any life slip through unnoticed. Every few months, she would receive letters from adopters telling her how one of Lawson's cats had transformed their homes. One became a therapy cat for a boy with selective mutism. Another had warned a deaf owner of a gas leak, the stories endless and quietly astonishing. But what moved her most came not in a letter but in a visit. A man in his 20s, thin, quiet, with tattoos down his forearms, walked into the shelter asking to see Willow. Not a cat person, he said, but he'd been in the system as a teen. His group home counselor had once volunteered at the shelter and made him read Lawson's story as a punishment. But the story had stuck, changed something in him, reminded him there was value in gentleness. Now he was clean, working in vet tech school, and just wanted to say thank you. Amelia led him out back, where Willow rested in a sunlit corner garden built for her comfort. And as the man knelt, Willow lifted her head, pressed it softly against his hand, and Amelia watched in silence as another invisible thread tied itself to Lawson's legacy. That night, as she turned off the lights and walked past the original framed photo of Lawson and Willow, she whispered aloud, "You never really left, did you?" And though the shelter was quiet, filled only with the sound of sleeping paws and distant purrs, she felt the answer settle like warmth across her shoulders. No, he hadn't left. He had simply become part of something that would never stop growing. Months later, the shelter received a large envelope with no return address, inside a simple typed letter and a check, a donation so large it could fund operations for years. The letter, unsigned, began with 4 words: "Because someone once stayed," and continued in plain language, explaining how a girl in another state had watched a documentary on Willow Shelter, seen a clip of Lawson sitting beside the willow tree with a kitten in his lap, and something inside her shifted. The girl had been on the verge of giving up, abandoned by her parents, living in a shelter not for animals but for teens cast aside. And she said that image, just a quiet man holding something broken with such care, reminded her that broken didn't mean unwanted. The money had come from someone who believed in that message, who didn't want to be named, only wanted the shelter to never close, never forget its roots. And Amelia read the letter 3 times, then passed it to her team, who stood silently in the office, awed not by the money, but by the ripple it confirmed. The shelter's work wasn't local anymore. It was generational, emotional, spiritual in ways no grant could define. That weekend, a new bench was built beneath the original willow tree, engraved with Lawson's full name and those same 4 words. Because someone once stayed, and Willow, now nearly 15, frail but present, was carried gently in Amelia's arms to sit beneath it, her eyes half closed, ears twitching at the breeze, and around them gathered not just volunteers but adopters, families, strangers, doctors, officers, people from every walk who'd been touched by this place, by this story, and they sat in silence for a moment of gratitude. No speeches, no ceremony, just breath and sky and memory. When Willow passed weeks later in her sleep, they buried her beneath that tree, next to the roots where Lawson's ashes had been quietly scattered years before. And in that place, where so much pain had once been carried, there now lived a rare stillness, a place where people came not just to adopt, but to remember what love looks like when no one is watching. And still, years on, Amelia would see it happen again and again. A girl crying in the kitten room, a father kneeling to help his son hold a rescued cat for the first time. A moment where someone almost turned away, and then didn't, because someone once stayed. Willow was gone, but her presence lingered in the shelter like sunlight through old glass. Quiet, warm, constant. Amelia didn't try to replace her. You don't replace animals like Willow, you carry them. She still caught herself looking for that white blur, curled up in the sunroom, or blinking slowly beside the porch swing. The space Willow left wasn't empty, it was inherited. Days turned into weeks, and one spring morning, something strange happened. A letter arrived addressed not to the shelter, but directly to Amelia. It was handwritten, postmarked from out of state, with careful script that trembled slightly, like the person behind it had paused often. Inside was a single photograph and a note that read, "You don't know me, but you saved my brother." The photo was of a young man, maybe late 20s, sitting on a curb with a cat in his lap. The cat looked familiar. Not exactly like Willow, but close. The same thoughtful face, the same trusting eyes. Amelia sat down slowly and read the rest of the letter. The writer explained that her brother had been in a halfway house 3 years ago, battling addiction and barely hanging on. One day, a volunteer brought in a cat from Willow shelter. The man didn't speak to anyone, barely ate, but he bonded with the cat. Said she looked at him like he was still worth something. That cat stayed with him through every shaky step toward sobriety. He named her Hope. A month ago, he passed away in his sleep, clean, sober, and loved. And Hope had stayed curled against his chest until the paramedics arrived. The sister wrote that she didn't have much to offer, but she wanted Amelia to know. What she'd built mattered beyond the walls of the shelter. That cat had saved her brother. And maybe, just maybe, that meant Willow had saved him too. Amelia folded the letter and held it against her chest. She thought about Mr. Lawson, about his words. All I ever did was stop walking. And she smiled through tears. Later that week, she framed the photo and letter together and placed it inside the main hallway where every volunteer passed each day. Above it, a new quote etched in brass, "You never know who you're saving." And then life moved on the way it always did. Softly, insistently, beautifully. A new litter arrived in a rainstorm. A child, shy and covered in bruises, opened up after meeting a one-eyed tabby named Brave. A teenager who'd once broken windows out of anger came back as an intern, gently feeding bottle kittens with hands that used to tremble with rage. And every single one of them asked, eventually, who was Willow? and Amelia always answered the same way. She was the one who came back, and in doing that, she made sure no one else had to be alone. There was no ending, only more arrivals, more lives saved, more people changed, because that's how legacy works. It doesn't die. It multiplies.